Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. Usually on the show, when we talk about UFOs, we're talking about unidentified flying objects. Tonight, our first story is about another kind of UFO, unidentified floating objects that have been appearing across Europe for the past several years. It's not just a phenomenon, it's a mystery, and it's tied to a single unpronounceable word, Tajipatir. I'm pretty sure I said that wrong, but just watch. France, November 2012. Louise Mamet is taking a stroll on a Brittany beach when the North Atlantic presents her with a bizarre gift. It's not a message in a bottle, it's a message on a tablet.
This is, I think, maybe 2 days after the storm. I looked at the seaweed and driftwood, and I said, oh my gosh, what's this? What's this?
It's a rubbery block that could almost be mistaken for a baseball base if it weren't for those perfect rectilinear letters, spelling out a word that Louise has never seen or heard before, Tajipatir. Now it gets stranger, because nearly 100 of these blocks have popped up all over Europe, including the UK, Netherlands, and even Denmark. What's going on? Jose de Cora found one of several that washed up on the coast of Spain.
Es la primera tableta, es el primer bloque que aparece en España, de aquí en unos 10 kilómetros así aproximadamente.
So where are all these blocks coming from? Journalist Aaron McCarthy has some theories.
When I think about mysterious incidents that involve a single word, I often think of the Roanoke colony. 1587, the same year they set up that colony, their governor goes back to England, and by the time he gets back, all of the citizens have disappeared, and all that is left is a single word carved into the defensive wall, Croatoan.
Croatoan was actually the name of a nearby island, so some speculate the carving was a mysterious clue to indicate a migration there. But no one was ever found. Are these floating bricks another ominous message from someone trying to tell us something? Strange things have washed up on beaches before. In the 1980s, Garfield telephones were found along the coast of France. So, one theory is these blocks are actually long-lost cargo from a shipwreck. But any theory has to take account of that word, Tajipatir. It's not in our language, but it is in our alphabet. And what to make of that rubbery substance? Let's ask our experts. After examining the mysterious blocks, physicist Matthew Shadagis thinks he can identify that substance.
These blocks are made of a type of rubber, actually, known as gutta percha. It's from the gum of a tree in Indonesia. In the early 20th century, gutta percha was used as cable sheathing for telegraph wires. So this could explain how it got from Indonesia to Europe, because it was actually a commercial product decades ago from a plantation in Indonesia.
A plantation called Tajipatir. It was located here, and since it was shipping the sheathing around the world, the tablets may have come off a sunken ship.
The density of gutta percha is about 0.3 grams per cubic centimeter. The density of water is about 1 gram per cubic centimeter. And so what that means is these blocks can easily bob to the surface from a sunken wreck.
And there's a twist. Gutta percha was used as an insulator until about 1940, when synthetic materials began to replace it. So if these blocks came from a sunken wreck, when did it go down? And why did it take decades for them to wash up on shore? Marine biologist Shay Conger looks for answers.
It was hypothesized that these could have been from the Titanic, which was shipwrecked in the North Atlantic. The Titanic's manifest showed that it did carry gutta percha during its maiden voyage. However, where the Titanic went under was a far cry from where these blocks washed up.
And Conger notes the Atlantic's ocean currents would likely move the blocks elsewhere, so that theory's sunk. But research shows these blocks may actually originate from a lesser-known ship dating back to World War I.
The Miyazaki Maru was a freighter that was actually sunk by German U-boats off the coast of Scilly, which is an archipelago of Cornwall.
That ship was carrying gutta percha. And another thing, there's been a salvage operation going on at the site of its wreck in recent years. The operation could have pierced the hull and dislodged the blocks from the ship, and that would explain why, after decades, the blocks have only recently been washing up on coastlines around Europe.
The location where the Miyazaki Maru was actually shipwrecked is right at the branch of the North Atlantic Current, so it makes sense that these would wash up on a lot of different beaches.
Meteorologist Juan Hernandez agrees the currents are capable of delivering this word on a tablet.
In the ocean, there's shallow currents and deep currents, which contribute to the more widespread transport of water across the world. So obviously, there is a source that these Jupiter blocks are coming from, although there is no exact pinpoint as to where. It's quite possible that they might make it around the world, might show up along the American coastline as well.
Our verdict is pretty clear. The blocks are gutta percha from the Jippetir plantation in Indonesia. The wreck of the Miyazaki Maru is a good theory, but there were many ships carrying such cargo 100 years ago, and more than one of them sank. So we still can't say for sure how the blocks got to Europe. The story may actually seem like an environmental disaster, but the good news is that gutta percha is a natural product, and unlike plastic, it does degrade over time. And now another wild story out of Asia, further north along the Pacific Rim. The Philippines is a country rich in history and legend, but by far its most famous and feared local creature is an evil shapeshifter known as the Aswang. Tales of the beast go back 500 years at least, but sightings still happen. 2 of them occurred just last year, and fortunately for us, they were caught on camera. Havia Iloilo, Philippines. A CCTV security camera rolls on a warm July evening in 2021. The camera captures a dimly lit street where a woman, later identified in the news as Mary Lou, sits in front of her home cleaning dishes. Unbeknownst to Mary Lou, a stranger approaches from behind. Then quickly, and as quietly as she arrives, the woman continues down the street, reaches a tree, then she seemingly folds over, dropping to the ground. The woman begins to crawl on all 4s back towards Mary Lou. Terrified, Mary Lou stands up and threatens to throw a bucket of water at her. The woman turns and runs away. Watch again. This moment, some people say she doesn't just bend over, but transforms. A week later, another alleged sighting in the same village captured on a second CCTV camera. This time, the person or creature switches between crawling and hopping. As we push in, we see a woman exiting her home, then jumping back in shock.
It doesn't look like an earthly sort of creature. The legs are bent in weird directions, and there's this long neck right there.
Field researcher Cliff Barrickman says the sightings made local news, with some believing the video captured a famed Filipino creature known as the Aswang.
One of the many stories about Aswangs is that during the day, they're just like people. They're people in your village that you may even know. But after night falls, they shapeshift. They have this proboscis tongue for lapping up blood. They go down on all 4s and change their shape and turns their legs around in weird positions. Aswangs are said to be responsible for miscarriages in the community, or really anything bad, like a child dies of some disease. It's kind of the catch-all boogeyman. If you want your kids to behave, it's like, don't go out there. Aswangs are out there.
The Aswang are believed to take the forms of vampires, were-dogs, and witches. It's said they can be warded off by salt, ash, or urine, depending on whom you ask. Is this mythical creature what we're seeing here? We'll need to ask our experts. Biology professor Floyd Hayes applies what's known as kinematics to the second video, the study of animal locomotion.
This creature appears to be quite flexible in its mode of locomotion. It appears to be hopping and transitioning between being quadrupedal and bipedal, unlike what's been reported for the Aswang.
Next, he turns to the creature's anatomy.
In my opinion, the body proportions are very similar to a human. The hind limbs appear to be much longer than the forelimbs, and the feet are pointing forward.
When we line up these proportions with that of a human, that certainly looks like a match. As for the head
is rather obscure in the image, but it looks as though it actually removes a hat as it exits the video.
Anthropologist Kathy Strain believes some legends are legitimate sightings of real creatures, but she's skeptical of this particular clip.
This could be a hoax because as the creature comes to this tree, it pops up and it looks over to see if this person is coming out of their door. That is more human-like, and because they want to make sure they're seen.
If it's a fake, Strain thinks it might be serving a higher purpose.
Folklore has a place in society to teach certain skill sets or certain beliefs.
Mythology across all cultures serves to reinforce cultural norms, such as the imperative for children to stay inside at night.
They get them home on time, to be generally afraid of strangers.
And indeed, we tracked down the guy who made the second video, and he admitted he staged the stunt after being inspired by the first Mary Lou video. Not for fun, but to help with COVID quarantine compliance during the pandemic.
After I saw that video, I was thinking that it might be an inspiration for me to do the hoax. So I did the video for the community purposes, just to force the children to stay inside of their home because it was in the midst of a pandemic. This is actually the mask that I wear on that time.
So that may explain the second video, but what about the first one that inspired it? Is it possible that an actual Aswang is responsible for terrifying Mary Lou in the alley?
When this lady comes back towards her and gets down on all fours, she's behaving like a typical Aswang, according to Filipino folklore. She's now gone into a different state where she's no longer human, and her trying to get closer to her without being seen indicates to me that she meant that lady harm. But you don't have a clear view of what she looked like when she was totally down on the ground. It's kind of dark. She's behind a fence. I'm willing to say that I don't really know what happened there.
So we have a split decision. We know the second clip is a hoax, but we can't say that for certain about the first. Aswangs are traditionally women, and while we don't know this woman's intent or state of mind, we do know she was crawling, and Mary Lou was genuinely frightened. We'll stay on the lookout for any future Aswang sightings. Canada has a long UFO history, and its government keeps a public record of sightings. In 2020, the number was 1,243, a notable uptick from the previous year, continuing a trend that goes back decades. But of all those sightings over all those years, there may be none as famous as this. November 7th, 1990. It's just after 7 p.m. in downtown Montreal, Canada. A guest is enjoying an evening swim in the rooftop pool at the Bonaventure Hotel, when suddenly she looks up into the sky and sees this. Look closely. 4 strange glowing green lights seem to point outward from the center like spokes, while 2 bright yellow lights can clearly be seen in the center of the object. The woman notifies management, and soon a group of people, including the police, come to the hotel rooftop. As the crowd gathers, initial estimates among witnesses place the lights at least 1,000 feet above the hotel. Journalist MJ Banias explains why this event is famous not only in Canadian history, but UFO lore.
The Bonaventure UFO incident was very unique because almost 30 people saw this strange object in the sky hovering above this hotel. And more bizarrely, this hovers above this hotel for 2 or 3 hours, and you would assume people in the city would see it. But the only people who were able to see this were the people on the roof of the hotel or on the sidewalk just outside it when they looked up.
Additionally, no aircraft was identified in that location by military or commercial radar. So what happened, and why this specific hotel?
2 UFO researchers were able to comprise a report quite quickly after the encounter, and they were able to collect significant witness testimony.
The witnesses all described to investigators a craft that matches what's seen in the photograph. But most intriguing is after the craft disappears, one witness later that night sees a boomerang-shaped object hovering over the Hydro-Quebec Long Point power station. Is it the same craft that hovered over the hotel?
This story has everything. And when you get a whole bunch of people telling the same story, it's going to automatically draw a lot of attention.
Montreal's Hotel Bonaventure is nestled on the top 2 floors of the sprawling 17-story Place Bonaventure. When it first opened in 1967, it was the world's largest commercial building at 3.1 million square feet, more than the Empire State Building. So perhaps the reason the alleged UFO in 1990 selected the Hotel Bonaventure was its size. But is it even a UFO? We asked our experts to take a look. We start with aviation expert Tim McMillan.
Basing it on the image here, possibly a helicopter that has a searchlight or some type of bright lights attached to it, but you would be able to see the warning lights that are on helicopters. Also, you can hear helicopters from miles away. They're loud, especially one that is hovering for 3 hours. That's a long time. But none of the eyewitnesses mentioned hearing a helicopter. So we could be looking at a drone, but this photograph was taken in 1990. The military-level drone technology was still in its infancy. And frankly, if we were looking at military testing drone technology, you don't do that over civilian populated areas.
In fact, McMillan believes if it's a flying machine, it's not one we know of.
We're able to rule out fixed-wing planes because they can't hover. I don't know of any good aerospace platform that would be able to fit both what we're seeing in the picture and what eyewitnesses said.
Is it possible location plays a factor? Meteorologist Juan Hernandez notes that Canada is well known for one of the most spectacular natural phenomena on Earth.
My initial thought was, could it be the aurora borealis? But aurora borealis often move and are quite transient. In this case, the report was stationary light that lasted for several hours.
But the hazy nature of the photo does lead Hernandez to investigate if Mother Nature could still be playing a role.
I was able to track down the weather observations from that day. We do have temperatures that were actually about 30 to 34 degrees while this was occurring, but the relative humidity itself was somewhat on the high side. So whenever you have something like this, you oftentimes develop either some sort of fog or low clouds.
For astronomer and video effects designer Mark D'Antonio, that may be the key to solving this mystery.
I believe that we're seeing a reflection back from the clouds, the fog, that look like something else. You've seen this every time you go out in your car and you drive along on a foggy night. So these lights could have been lights from the pool and from some other lighting around the Bonaventure Hotel, reflecting up into the sky and then down to the pool again.
It's a plausible theory, but if it was the reflected pool light, wouldn't the guests and police there that night have put two and two together? Plus, consider this. It's been 30 years. There have been many foggy nights in Montreal in that time, and if it's a reflection, it's one that's never been seen again.
Whenever you're trying to form a really good investigation, you're testing different hypotheses, but I'm inclined to believe that multiple, potentially up to 80 witnesses, someone would have been able to determine if it was a light being reflected categorically, based on the image and what the eyewitnesses said. It is a UFO.
Our verdict? We're going with genuine UFO. As McMillan says, while there are plausible theories, in our view, we still don't have a smoking gun. The Hotel Bonaventure incident is still considered one of the most famous UFO sightings in Canada. So much so that in 2020, it was depicted on a $20 silver glow-in-the-dark coin. Giant menacing canines have been featured in literature for ages. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles about a murder supposedly committed by a huge dog. Stephen King's Cujo centers on a rabid St. Bernard. All works of fiction, or so we thought. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Maybe you should be. September 2018, Saskatchewan, Canada. A local fishing guide is going about a normal day in his lodge when he spies something strange out his window. Something dark and hairy is huddled on the ground amongst the trees. At first, it looks like a small bear, and then it stands and nearly triples in height. It's a huge wolf, and we only understand its scale when it lunges at the regular-sized dog who's defensively barking. The animals quarrel until the man goes to intervene. Let's see that again.
This large shape suddenly becomes animated and springs up and charges at the dog. And much to my shock and horror, it appears to be a wolf of mind-boggling proportions. It's truly monstrous.
Field researcher Ken Gerhardt tells us of the giant wolf's prominent stature in folklore.
There have long been legends of monstrous, bloodthirsty wolves. In France, we have the beast of Gévaudan. In Alaska, there's something known as the Amarok, or demon wolf. And nearby in the Nahanni Valley of Canada, we have something known as the Wahila. The Nahanni Valley is also known as the Headless Valley because the decapitated bodies of prospectors and trappers have been found there and have been linked to the legend of this giant wolf-like Wahila. So we have these long enduring traditions of giant wolves, and we have to wonder if there might be a grain of truth to this legend.
Some have speculated that this wolf might be more familiar than we think, a creature not from the realm of legend, but from our own prehistory.
The largest gray wolves, Canis lupus, have been known to achieve weights of about 200 pounds. But if we go back over 10,000 years ago to the Pleistocene epoch, there were these monstrous bone-crushing wolves known as dire wolves, Canis dirus. A relic population of dire wolves may have survived as recently as 4,000 years ago in Arkansas's Ozarks. We could be dealing with a dire wolf genetic code that's been locked into modern wolves and is now resurfacing in this remarkable individual.
An interesting note about that French beast of Gévaudan. Though that monster wolf lived on and kept killing after being driven off by a young boy, that kid was rewarded for his bravery. King Louis XV paid for his education. Now let's get the educated opinion on this specimen. Could there be something off about this wolf's genetics? Some sort of mutation? There is a phenomenon called an atavism, where a creature has traits from its ancestors preserved in its genes. However, it's unlikely in this case, as atavisms aren't likely to manifest in the form of a canine size. An extra toe is more likely. Then what's going on here? Wildlife biologist Stephanie Shuttler isn't crying wolf, she's crying hoax.
To me, it didn't look like the dog was in danger. That was really suspicious. So that's what makes me think that it was a CGI.
When someone suspects a fake, we call in Michael Primo, our forensic video analyst.
It's my conclusion that there is no additional information that was introduced into these recordings that would be similar to something that was CGI'd or manufactured.
With the clip appearing to be legitimate, biologist Floyd Hayes discusses the creature's resemblance to the dire wolf.
The dire wolf is a little bit larger than a wolf with a larger head and smaller feet.
What's more, the dire wolf had shorter, stockier legs to keep them warmer during the cold winter months. The wolf we see here is proportioned much more similarly to our modern-day canine. So with all other possibilities unlikely, Hayes says it's just a gray wolf. But there's a surprise. He did a size calculation and found this specimen to be one of the largest wolves ever documented. Hayes says the dog looks like a type of husky, which tend to grow a little over 2 feet tall and around 60 pounds. And the wolf looks about 1.5 times larger than the dog here. Hayes guesses this wolf is about 3 feet tall and 6.5 feet from end to end. That's longer than most men are tall. And what's more, it's nearly a record. Compared to the largest wolf ever recorded, Hayes thinks this is only half an inch shorter. So this wolf is truly a gargantuan. Incredible. Our verdict, an actual wolf who just happens to be quite large for his species. This is not a supernatural creature, but he is an outlier. How he got that big is still a mystery. But we know he's a loner who probably branched off to form his own pack. We all wonder if there is other life out there in the universe. In fact, many believe aliens have been observing our planet for thousands of years, citing everything from the pyramids in Egypt to the Nazca lines in Peru as evidence of contact. Now, a strange discovery in a recent NASA photo has some saying these visitors haven't just been observing Earth. Check out what we found on our next-door neighbor, Mars. In March 2006, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter begins its mission of studying the atmosphere and terrain of the red planet. Since then, the orbiter has taken almost 7 million pictures of the Martian surface, but it wasn't until 2021 that somebody noticed this. It's a pair of long parallel lines with indentations that lead to what appears to be a half-buried disk. And take a closer look. See that perfectly shaped crescent edge? George Haas, director of the Cydonia Institute, explains what the buzz is all about.
A South African researcher says he found what appeared to be the remains of a UFO crash. The object that he was looking at was between 12 and 15 meters in diameter. And it could be the remains of a flying disc that had crashed on the red planet.
If it was a flying saucer, did it come from Mars or somewhere else in the galaxy? And if so, was it observing Mars because there was a civilization there? Haas says many believe ancient civilizations, including one called the Cydonians, once thrived on the red planet.
There's been lots of evidence that there are pyramidal structures and all types of mound formations on the planet that do not look normal. One formation in particular, the famous Paratopia parrot that was taken by NASA has over 22 points of anatomical correctness, which goes way beyond any natural formation.
But Haas believes the Sidonians vanished from Mars millions of years ago after a war that led to nuclear Armageddon. So who could this ship belong to?
For people that believe this UFO crash on Mars is a natural UFO, it may be connected to the Greys that visit our planet. They've been visiting our planet for millennia, and possibly visiting Mars also. Some believe that the gray aliens crashed at Roswell, and they may have also lost control of one of their vehicles on Mars.
Now, we know people have been seeing alleged signs of civilization on Mars ever since this famous face was discovered in a 1976 photograph taken by Viking 1. Most of these images, including the face, were revealed to be natural geological formations once higher resolution images became available. But what about this? I mean, that clean, circular edge is pretty clear. Couldn't that really be the back edge of a flying saucer? Look at the outer edge. This would be the crash path right here. And it sure doesn't look natural. Let's find out what our experts think. We start with astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy. For billions of years, our solar system has been bombarded with objects. Could this be a meteor that streaked from out of the sky?
Take a look at the moon. On the surface of the moon, there's a crater called Messier A. And what that is a shallow meteor impact that came in at a very shallow angle and carved out elliptical-shaped craters. This is how a normal asteroid crash would look if it comes in at a shallow angle. However, on this specific trail leading up to the object, you don't see much of that. This object itself is still intact.
So then how can we explain the smooth crescent shape of the disk?
There is speculation that it could potentially be the heat shield off of a probe that got ejected into the Martian surface.
Since 1960, there have been around 50 attempts to send probes directly to Mars, but only about half have been successful. Is this disk the remnant of a failure?
If you look at the trench this object crashed in on, it looks pretty wide and deep. To me, that rules out any kind of heat shield crash because the heat shield from a probe wouldn't necessarily have enough energy to carve out such a trench.
So if it's not man-made, could we be looking at the remains of an alien spaceship? For that answer, we turn to NASA geologist Bob Anderson. Anderson says the location of the formation is an important clue to solving the mystery.
This area is called Candor Chasm, which is parallel to the Valles Marineris. Valles Marineris is the Grand Canyon of Mars. It's a huge rift, a crack that's 7 miles down and would go the distance of Los Angeles to New York. Valles Marineris is covered by volcanic plains, a combination of sedimentary layers and volcanic lava flows. These long streaks that you see going across the surface here, those are common all over Mars.
What looks like the trail of a crashed UFO is actually an ancient geologic crack in the surface of Mars. But if it's a natural crack, how did the object at the end of the trail get the perfect curve of a spaceship?
If you look really closely, you can see this one just happens to be perfectly arcuate here, most likely because the winds are coming over and then they're falling into the crack. And the only thing that's given everybody the idea that it's a spaceship is those dunes that are around the front that make it look like there's a circular disc.
But McCarthy isn't convinced.
To me, this object doesn't seem to have gotten here through natural processes. Its shape and the way it seemed to settle into the landscape is completely different than any other object we've seen on the Martian surface. But as to what this object is, I can only speculate.
So it seems we have another split decision here. While Dr. Anderson's theory checks all the boxes, McCarthy's point that finding a naturally perfect curve does seem too good to be true. Our verdict? For now, until we can get a closer look and confirm what's there, we're going to go with unexplained phenomenon. And if it is a crashed UFO, we'll be the first to let you know. What goes up must come down. It's a law of physics that seems immutable. But what if under special circumstances, this basic rule of the universe might bend or even break? It's January 2019 and the skies over Częstochowa, Poland. Pilot Lukasz Shapila is building up a thirst as he puts his stunt plane through its paces in a series of acrobatic maneuvers. And then he does something you've never seen before at an air show. As Lukasz goes into a barrel roll, he picks up a can of energy drink and begins pouring it into a stationary cup. He then places the can down and picks up the glass to take a sip without spilling a drop.
This video is wild. Look at him. He's just drinking his drink, living his life, flying upside down in a plane.
Since it's hard enough pouring a glass right side up on a commercial flight, folks on the internet offered a wild explanation.
Some have theorized that what's actually happening here is that he's flying through an area that has a gravitational anomaly of some kind.
Back in December 1945, 5 torpedo bombers known as Flight 19 vanished near the Bermuda Triangle after the flight commander reported his compass going haywire. Perhaps gravitational fluctuations were at play, since we know that gravity is not the same everywhere on Earth or in the atmosphere. But hang on a second. We live in the age of deep fakes, and we've already debunked videos like this commercial jet barrel roll. Could this all be an elaborate hoax? Or is this gravity acting in a brand new way? Let's consult our experts. Forensic video analyst Michael Primo examines the metadata to check if there are any computer-generated graphics involved.
So the major light source through the physical aspects of the scene analysis, looking at shadow information, looking at reflections as the user is moving around in the shield of the cockpit, are all indications that this was not CGI.
So if the video isn't faked, is there something atypical about the design of the plane? Aviation expert Tim McMillan takes a closer look at the aircraft to determine its capabilities.
This plane, I would say, is very likely a Zika Edge 540, which is purpose-built aerobatic aircraft. The design is very similar to World War II planes, like the P-51 Mustang. When pilots engaged in dogfights, they had to do a lot of aerobatic maneuvers. Same principle. The plane itself is not designed to let you pour a drink upside down. That's a whole other side of physics.
Then could this be some sort of anomaly causing the laws of gravity to malfunction? Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku confirmed that gravity is different around the world, especially at the equator, where its grounding forces are weaker due to the centrifugal forces produced by the Earth's rotation.
We know that the Earth is a ball and it spins like this. If you're sitting on the North Pole, then for the most part, your radial velocity is 0. If you're on the equator, the Earth is 8,000 miles in diameter, so you're going around about 1,000 miles an hour. Gravity is going to be slightly less as a consequence.
This gravitational variation also means that you weigh 0.5% more at the poles than at the equator.
But that's a very tiny effect. Too small to explain the fact that he can do a barrel roll and have the liquid stay inside that cup. So how does this work? Let's say I get a pail of water on a string and I twirl it. The centrifugal force pushes the string out and the water stays inside the bucket. It doesn't fall out at all.
Kaku says that's because though both the water and the bucket are being pulled downward by gravity, the force at the string redirects them in a circular path, keeping the water inside the bucket. It's a similar effect in the plane where the speed of the circular motion counteracts the downward effects of gravity.
This means that he's attained 1 G of centrifugal force. That equals the G on the surface of the Earth. He is rotating fast enough, 32 feet per second squared, to create artificial gravity inside that cockpit. And that's why the liquid doesn't fall out of the cup.
Our verdict, centrifugal force created by this rapid rotation. There's no need to fake this trick because this fascinating property of physics is all that's needed to create zero gravity and prevent the drink from spilling. It is not uncommon to find remains of deceased animals on a walk in the woods. What's weird is when those remains don't look like anything we remember from biology class. It's January 17th, 2019. Art student Kohei Katawaki says he is hiking through the dense woods near his home in Chichibu City, Japan, when he comes upon a figure that is totally alien to him. The footage and photos show what looks like the skeletal remains of some creature, but what? As we zoom in for a closer look, we can see it has strange, long, twisted talons. Its spine is severely bent with a bone structure that looks almost bird-like. But then there's the head, which is more square-shaped, which conjures the image of Hollywood extraterrestrials. And we see 2 rows of yellow humanoid-like teeth. It's no wonder Kohei was compelled to post the video online.
Obviously, one theory about this thing is that it is not of this world. There are things about it that are very E.T. by way of a giraffe. It does sort of have the head shape that a gray alien might have.
As we mentioned earlier, gray aliens are the most frequently cited extraterrestrials in reports of close encounters and abductions, such as the famous Barney and Betty Hill abduction claim from 1961. They described grays as having small, hairless humanoid bodies with large heads and black eyeballs. These remains fit that description somewhat, but there are other possibilities as well.
Maybe this creature is the result of radiation fallout. Japan was the site of 2 nuclear detonations in World War II, and more recently there was the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, which was rated a number 7 on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale, which was the same as Chernobyl.
A lot of speculation on this one. There was even buzz that it was some kind of biological experiment gone wrong. The obvious explanation is that it's a hoax, but gray alien sightings are always a hot topic. So we'll give this figure its day in court. First, we take the footage to anthropologist Kathy Strain, who has researched accounts of gray aliens. So how does this corpse compare?
When people talk about the grays, they usually bring up that there's little ones and there's big ones. And the larger ones have very long necks and they're very skinny. And this doesn't really look like that because the proportion with the long neck and the head isn't correct for it to be one of the taller grays. The legs should be much, much longer. The arms should be much longer. Everything should be scaled upward in size.
What about the nuclear radiation theory?
The chances that the skeletons are still out in the wild is unlikely.
Raccoons eat dead animals, and they are so prevalent in Japan, their overpopulation is causing a national hubbub. In the past decade, the country's raccoon population has tripled. Strange says any corpse decomposing in the woods outside Chichibu since the 2011 Fukushima disaster would have been picked apart by wildlife scavengers. And she points out something else that bothers her.
Its eye sockets are too small to actually have an exterior eyeball. You may be born without physical exterior eyes, but you would still have human-sized eye sockets below the skin.
Microphthalmia is a phenomenon in which someone's born with 1 or 2 eyes that are very small. The eye sockets on this creature are small, but they appear too tiny even for a creature with microphthalmia. Biologist Floyd Hayes is also skeptical that these remains ever belong to a living being.
There are ways in which we could change the morphology of the animal, typically by giving it an extra limb or a digit or even a head. But to get something to change so dramatically, like the entire head shape, so it's sticking out on both sides or a much longer neck, that's much more difficult to do.
Hayes is left with one remaining possibility.
I believe this is a hoax.
Given that none of the theories seem to hold up, we tracked down Kohei in Japan. And when pressed, he admitted the alien corpse is a project he created for his studies at Tokyo University of the Arts.
それも、その父親の買ってきたその本っていうのもインスピレーションの一つにあると思いますし、絵本がインスピレーションのもとに結構いっぱいあるのではと思ってまして、やっぱり心のどこか 1%、2% では本気で、宇宙人とかってやっぱいるんじゃないかなって信じてるんですよね。なので。
So, mystery solved. This was a clever hoax.
The first time the footage appeared on the monitors at the anonymous industrial park in New Jersey, it was dismissed with the same reflexive smirk that usually greeted shaky videos of lights in the sky or shadows darting between trees. Yet this time the room did not quite relax back into routine skepticism, because the image lingered in a way that unsettled even the veterans who had built their careers on disproving the unbelievable, and what they were seeing was not a blur or a trick of. Exposure but a figure, framed sharply against the sodium orange glow of a rural road in Mindanao, its limbs elongated at impossible angles as it descended from the canopy with a deliberate, almost careful grace, and the timestamp embedded in the footage placed it at 2:14 a.m., a detail that mattered only because the witness, a truck driver named Ramon Alvarez, had sworn that the thing had been pacing his vehicle for nearly 5 minutes before he dared to slow down enough to reach for his phone, his voice cracking as he narrated how the shape matched stories his grandmother told him as a child, stories of Aswang, a creature that did not merely hunt but studied, and as the production team replayed the clip frame by frame, isolating pixels, enhancing contrast, and mapping the motion vectors, the host leaned forward with a familiar cadence that viewers of The Proof Is Out There had come to trust, explaining that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, even as his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity he could not quite suppress, because when the figure dropped from the tree, its center of mass shifted in a way that suggested intent rather than accident, and the analysis software flagged the movement as inconsistent with known animals of that region, a fact that would later be downplayed in the final cut, but was impossible to ignore in the raw room where speculation still breathed freely. Outside the studio, across an ocean and a vacuum, another anomaly was being cataloged, this one buried in terabytes of data from a Mars reconnaissance orbiter that had been quietly updated with a new machine learning filter designed to identify artificial debris, a tool meant to track humanity's own mistakes, lost probes, and forgotten heat shields. Yet the algorithm returned a hit that made no sense. An object half embedded in the regolith of Elysium Planitia, its silhouette symmetrical, its edges too clean, and its orientation misaligned with the surrounding impact patterns, prompting a junior analyst named Gianna Ruiz to tag it with a comment that would later be scrutinized word by word. Possible non-natural origin. Recommend secondary review. A sentence so cautiously phrased that it should have vanished into bureaucracy, but instead triggered a chain of quiet escalations, because the object appeared to have skidded, not fallen, leaving behind a shallow furrow that suggested controlled descent rather than catastrophic impact, and as the Martian sun cast long shadows across the plain, the shape resolved into something disturbingly familiar, like the fuselage of an aircraft compressed by gravity and time, its surface reflecting light at angles inconsistent with oxidized alloys, and for a brief moment, before protocol reasserted itself, the room went silent. The kind of silence that arrives when trained minds realize they are standing at the edge of a question they are not authorized to ask. Back on Earth, the Aswang footage aired with its usual trappings of doubt, experts suggesting hoaxes, misidentified primates, or optical illusions caused by rolling shutter artifacts, yet emails began to arrive from viewers in the Philippines, elders and hunters, and people who had never sent a message to a television show before, all saying variations of the same thing, that the creature in the video moved like something that had once been human and had learned, painfully, to become something else. And among those emails was one from a retired aerospace engineer named Gilberto G.I. Salazar, who had spent the last decade trying to forget what he saw during a classified recovery operation in the late 1990s, when an object fell from the sky into the South China Sea and was officially logged as space debris, even though its internal geometry did not match any catalog satellite. And as G.I. watched the episode, pausing on the frame where the Aswang's eyes caught the light, reflecting not red but a muted amber, he felt a tightening in his chest, because that reflection reminded him of the same material sheen he had seen inside the wreckage years ago, a surface that absorbed light until it didn't, a surface that seemed to react to observation itself. The show's host, unaware of the connections forming in living rooms and secure facilities alike, transitioned smoothly to another segment, this one about a plane rumored to have crashed on Mars, a claim so audacious it bordered on parody, yet the producers had learned that dismissing such stories outright only fueled belief, so instead they laid out the facts, showing archival images of Mars that, when rotated and enhanced, appeared to reveal a cylindrical object with wing-like protrusions, a shape first popularized by amateur researchers who insisted it resembled a commercial jet, and the experts patiently explained pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns in random data, while the camera lingered just long enough on the image to let doubt seep in, because even as the explanation satisfied logic, something about the proportions nagged at the subconscious. And viewers could not help but imagine the impossible journey that would place such a machine on another world. In Manila, Ramon Alvarez replayed his own footage again and again, noticing details he had missed in the terror of the moment. The way the creature's joints bent backward like a bird's, the faint distortion around its outline as if the air itself resisted its presence, and he wondered why his phone battery had drained so quickly afterward, a detail no one on the show mentioned, but that would later appear in other reports. A pattern too consistent to ignore once it was seen, and when he finally slept, he dreamed of red soil and a sky the wrong color, of something watching him from behind a rusted hull half buried in dust. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Gianna Ruiz was told to forget the object, her access quietly revoked, her curiosity reframed as a learning experience, yet she could not shake the feeling that she had been close to something important, and in her frustration, she turned to the only place that still allowed questions without credentials, an online forum dedicated to dissecting episodes of The Proof Is Out There, where she posted anonymously about pattern recognition and false negatives, careful to avoid specifics, only to receive a private message from a user named GI_S, who asked, with unsettling precision, whether she believed an object could survive interplanetary transit without burning, and whether folklore ever preserved truths that science dismissed too quickly. The convergence was slow, almost polite, threads weaving across disciplines that rarely spoke to one another, but the show had done what it always did best, which was not to provide answers, but to create a space where questions multiplied, and as ratings climbed, so did the number of tips, some absurd, some mundane, and a few that caused the producers to glance nervously at the legal department before forwarding them to consultants who no longer officially consulted for anyone because among the messages was a composite theory that linked shape-shifting creatures, anomalous crashes, and a long-suppressed incident involving a craft that did not originate from Earth, but did not arrive alone either, a theory that suggested the Aswang was not a monster born of superstition but a survivor, altered by exposure to an environment not meant for human biology, and that the object on Mars was not a plane but a vessel that had failed to complete a return journey, its passengers adapting in desperate ways that bled into myth when they finally came home. When the episode ended, the host signed off with his usual measured smile, reminding viewers to keep questioning, to submit their evidence, to remember that the truth is out there, a phrase so familiar it had become almost comforting. Yet that night, in homes across the world, sleep came reluctantly because comfort depends on distance, and distance was shrinking, not in miles or light years, but in understanding, as if something old and patient had noticed humanity's renewed curiosity and was deciding whether it was time to be seen again, not as a revelation, not as an invasion, but as proof. By the time the second wave of footage reached the production servers, the internal mood had shifted from amused attachment to something closer to restrained vigilance, because the new material did not arrive through the usual channels of anonymous uploads and sensational subject lines, but through a retired satellite engineer who attached schematics instead of theories, diagrams annotated with dates, orbital decay estimates, and a quiet insistence that the object on Mars share dimensional ratios with an experimental lifting body craft scrapped decades before it was ever acknowledged, and this insistence mattered because the engineer, like G.I. Salazar, had once signed documents that no longer officially existed, and when he spoke about tolerances and alloys, he did so with the weary precision of someone who had argued these points behind closed doors and lost. The show's researchers, trained to maintain a posture of neutrality, found themselves running cross-comparisons late into the night, overlaying Martian imagery with declassified aerospace concepts, discovering that the alignment was not perfect but uncomfortably close, as if the design had been iterated upon somewhere far from peer review, somewhere failure was not an option because failure meant being stranded. Meanwhile, in Mindanao, reports of livestock mutilations circulated quietly through barangays, not dramatic enough for national headlines, but consistent enough to unsettle those who noticed patterns, the wounds surgical, the blood absent, and always accompanied by witnesses who spoke of a smell like metal after rain, a detail that Ramon Alvarez remembered vividly, because it was the same scent that clung to his cab long after the figure vanished into the trees, a scent that no amount of cleaning could remove, as if it had soaked into the fabric of the world itself. When a local journalist tried to connect these events to the episode, he was cautioned by his editor to avoid folklore framing, to stick to verifiable facts, but facts were proving elusive, slipping away under scrutiny, leaving behind impressions and correlations that resisted tidy explanation. On Mars, Gianna Ruiz watched from the outside as her colleagues debated data she could no longer access, reading between lines in published abstracts, noting sudden shifts in language, an increased reliance on statistical noise explanations, and a conspicuous absence of follow-up images from the region where the object lay, as if the planet itself had become classified. And she began to wonder whether curiosity was not being discouraged but redirected, shepherded away from questions that led too far, too fast. Her correspondence with G.I. Salazar deepened, their messages cautious yet charged, circling around shared intuitions without naming them outright, until one night he sent her a scanned page from an old field notebook, its edges yellowed, containing a sketch of a humanoid form with elongated limbs and annotations about muscular density changes under altered gravity, notes he had once dismissed as speculative, yet now read like a confession written before the crime was understood. As The Proof Is Out There prepared its next episode, the producers debated whether to revisit the Aswang story, worried about accusations of cultural insensitivity, but the data compelled them forward because new footage had surfaced, captured by a thermal camera mounted on a coconut plantation fence, showing a bipedal heat signature moving against the wind, its body temperature fluctuating in pulses rather than a steady glow, and when analyzed, those pulses matched no known metabolic rhythm, human or animal, instead resembling the thermal regulation cycles observed in certain hibernating species, except compressed into seconds rather than hours, a finding that raised eyebrows even among skeptics. The host rehearsed his lines with extra care, emphasizing uncertainty, reminding viewers that correlation does not imply causation, yet the script could not fully contain the unease creeping into his delivery, because each attempt to ground the narrative in rational explanation only highlighted how much remained ungrounded. In a small town outside Quezon City, an elderly woman watched the episode and laughed softly, telling her granddaughter that the Aswang stories were never about monsters, but about returnees, people who left and came back wrong, carrying the sky with them in their bones, a metaphor the child would later repeat online, stripped of its poetry and rendered into a meme, yet the phrase lingered, because metaphors often survive where facts fracture. The Mars segment aired with updated graphics, the alleged crashed craft reframed as a geological anomaly, experts explaining erosional processes and the mind's hunger for narrative, yet the producers slipped in a new comparison, almost as an aside, noting that the object's shadow length suggested a hollow interior, a detail quickly dismissed but not forgotten, because hollow things imply design, and design implies purpose, and purpose demands a maker. Gianna Ruiz noticed the insertion immediately, recognizing it as a compromise, a breadcrumb for those paying attention, and she felt a flicker of gratitude mixed with frustration, because breadcrumbs are only useful if one is allowed to follow them. In the Philippines, Ramon Alvarez received a visit from men who did not identify themselves but asked polite questions about his truck's maintenance history, his phone model, his social media usage, and whether he had experienced any unusual dreams since the incident, their tone professional, their interest unsettling, and when they left, he realized they had not asked him to retract his story, only to remember it differently, a subtle pressure that left him more shaken than an outright threat would have. G.I. Salazar, watching these developments from his modest apartment, felt the weight of years pressing in, memories of briefings that spoke of biological adaptation under extreme conditions, of contingency plans that assumed survivors would not return unchanged, and of a decision, made quietly, to let folklore absorb what official channels could not acknowledge, because myths are pliable, and denial is easier when truth wears the mask of superstition. As online communities dissected the episodes frame by frame, theories proliferated, some wild, some incisive, weaving together threads of ancient legend, aerospace anomalies, and suppressed research into tapestries that were easy to dismiss precisely because they were too comprehensive, too unsettling in their coherence, and amid the noise, a pattern emerged, not in content, but in reaction. As posts that connected disparate phenomena with careful sourcing were removed more quickly than sensational nonsense, suggesting that moderation was not merely about accuracy, but about containment. The show's host received an unmarked envelope containing a single photograph, grainy yet unmistakable, showing a humanoid figure standing beside a metallic structure half buried in red dust, the horizon wrong, the sky pale, and on the back, written in a steady hand, were the words "not crashed." Abandoned, a message that arrived without context yet resonated deeply, because abandonment implies choice, and choice implies agency, and agency complicates every comforting narrative humanity has constructed about being alone. As the production team debated whether the photograph was an elaborate hoax, the host found himself staring at the figure's posture, the slight tilt of the head, the familiar curve of curiosity, and he wondered whether proof was not something waiting to be discovered, but something deciding whether it was time to be acknowledged. When the episode ended, the usual social media storm followed, believers and skeptics clashing with predictable fervor, yet beneath the surface arguments, a quieter shift occurred, as viewers began to ask not whether the Aswang existed or whether a craft lay on Mars, but what it meant if survival itself required transformation, if returning home demanded a shedding of what once defined humanity, and if myths were not relics of ignorance, but records of adaptation, stories told to make the unbearable bearable, and as night fell across continents, dreams once again filled with red horizons and watching eyes, the question lingered, unspoken yet insistent, not about what was out there, but about what had already come back. The third episode aired without fanfare, yet within hours it became clear that something subtle had shifted, because viewers were no longer merely reacting to the evidence presented, but interrogating the absences between segments, the moments where the host hesitated, where a graphic faded a second too early, where an expert redirected a sentence as if avoiding an unseen boundary. And this growing literacy in omission coincided with a development that never made it on screen, a sealed meeting between producers and a representative from a government office whose name changed depending on who was asked, an office that specialized not in censorship but in risk mitigation, explaining calmly that certain narratives, when combined, created psychological volatility, and volatility, while not illegal, was inconvenient. The meeting ended politely, with no explicit demands, only suggestions about balance and responsibility, yet the effect lingered, because the producer's new suggestion was often more powerful than command. In the Philippines, Ramon Alvarez stopped driving night routes altogether, not because he feared seeing the creature again, but because he sensed, with an intuition sharpened by fear, that whatever had followed him that night had already moved on, its attention drawn elsewhere, perhaps by the increasing noise of investigation, perhaps by something older stirring beneath the scrutiny, and as he adjusted to daylight work, he began to notice others like him, people who had glimpsed something unclassifiable and were now quietly altering their lives around that knowledge, avoiding certain places, certain times, as if instinctively respecting a boundary they could not articulate. Online, Gianna Ruiz found herself drawn deeper into conversations that felt less like forums and more like whispered conferences, encrypted channels where participants shared data fragments without attribution, images stripped of metadata, equations half-complete, trusting that others would recognize their significance. And through these exchanges, she learned of a pattern in atmospheric anomalies near regions rich in folklore about shapeshifters, not only in the Philippines but in parts of Eastern Europe, South America, and isolated Pacific islands, places where stories spoke of beings that fell from the sky and learned to wear human skin imperfectly, and while the academic in her bristled at the lack of rigor, another part recognized the same discomfort she felt when her algorithm flagged the Martian object, the sense that data was pointing somewhere consensus was not ready to follow. G.I. Salazar, emboldened by the momentum he sensed building beneath the surface, reached out to an old colleague who had once worked on life support systems designed for prolonged exposure to reduced gravity, a man who now taught engineering ethics and spoke publicly about sustainability, and over coffee that tasted like compromise, GI asked a question framed as hypothetical about what would happen to human physiology after years in an environment with different atmospheric pressure and radiation exposure, and the colleague answered carefully, listing muscle atrophy, bone density loss, cardiovascular changes, then paused, lowering his voice to speculate about adaptive countermeasures, genetic expression shifts, bioengineered symbioses, things that would never be approved but might emerge under survival pressure. And as he spoke, GI felt the old dread return, because survival was never passive in the programs he remembered. It was always engineered. Meanwhile, The Proof Is Out There received a submission that defied easy categorization, a video recorded inside what appeared to be a cavern, its walls smooth and metallic, reflecting the light of a handheld device in muted tones, the air filled with a low-frequency hum that interfered with the audio, and at the edge of the frame, a figure moved, partially obscured, its proportions wrong but its movements purposeful, and the sender's message was brief, stating only that the location was not Earth but close enough, a phrase that sent chills through the review team because it echoed language used in speculative mission briefs decades earlier. The experts consulted on the clip argued vigorously, some claiming advanced CGI, others pointing out inconsistencies that suggested practical effects rather than digital fabrication, yet none could convincingly explain the environmental acoustics or the material properties suggested by the reflections, and in the end, the clip was shelved, deemed too risky to air without context. Yet its existence weighed on the team, a silent accusation against their role as gatekeepers of curiosity. In Mindanao, a group of elders convened a meeting not for the cameras but for themselves, discussing signs they had noticed, animals migrating unpredictably, weather patterns shifting subtly, and dreams shared across households that featured the same imagery, a red plane, a broken vessel, and figures learning to breathe again. And while they framed these discussions in spiritual language, invoking balance and respect, the underlying concern was practical, about coexistence, about whether the returnees remembered the rules that once governed the boundary between worlds. Gianna Ruiz's anonymous exchanges led her to a data set smuggled out of an observatory, showing transient electromagnetic disturbances correlating with reported sightings, spikes that suggested localized manipulation of energy fields, and as she overlaid this with folklore maps, a crude yet compelling alignment emerged, implying that whatever technology enabled interplanetary travel might also facilitate something like phased perception, a way of slipping between states, appearing monstrous. Only because the observer's senses were unprepared for the transition. The show's host, increasingly uneasy, began keeping a private journal, jotting down impressions that did not fit the script, noting how certain guests avoided eye contact when discussing adaptation, how others leaned too eagerly into debunking, and how his own dreams had changed, becoming more vivid, populated by images he could not trace to waking exposure. And he wondered whether immersion in these stories was altering his perception, or whether perception itself was being tuned by proximity to an idea whose time had come. Ratings continued to climb, paradoxically driven by the show's restraint, because audiences sensed the tension between what was shown and what was withheld, and in that tension, imagination flourished, sometimes recklessly, sometimes insightfully, but always with a hunger that could not be satisfied by dismissal alone. G.I. Salazar received another envelope, this one containing a medical report from years ago, its patient name redacted, detailing physiological anomalies inconsistent with known conditions, including altered muscle fiber composition and ocular adaptations suited to low light, high radiation environments, and attached was a note in a familiar hand, asking simply whether GI still believed some doors were better left closed, a question that haunted him because he had once argued passionately for closure, for containment, believing that ignorance could be a form of mercy, yet now, watching myths harden into patterns, he wondered whether secrecy had merely delayed reckoning, allowing the story to be told in distorted forms rather than confronted directly. As the third episode aired, featuring a cautious revisit to the Mars anomaly and a brief mention of biological resilience in extreme environments. The online response was electric, not because of what was said, but because of what was implied, and in the comment sections, amid the noise, a few voices articulated a quiet fear that humanity's fascination with proof was less about discovery than about permission. Permission to accept that we are not fixed, that survival may require change so profound it fractures identity, and that the monsters of folklore might be mirrors held up to futures we have already glimpsed. In a remote village, a child pointed at the sky and asked whether people could fall upward, a question that made the adults laugh nervously, because laughter is often the first line of defense against the unbearable, and as night settled, the stars looked the same as ever, yet felt closer, less distant, as if the space between here and elsewhere had thinned, not through technology alone, but through story, through repetition, through the slow erosion of certainty, and somewhere, whether on a red plain or in the shadowed canopy of a forest, something listened, patient, adaptive, waiting to see whether humanity would recognize itself in the proof it so desperately sought. What changed after the fourth broadcast was not the volume of evidence, but the tone of silence surrounding it, a silence that settled like dust after an unseen impact, because while the show continued to receive submissions at an unprecedented rate, the nature of those submissions evolved from frantic attempts to prove something into quieter offerings, fragments offered not to convince but to be acknowledged, as if the contributors sensed that proof was no longer the point, that recognition itself had become the scarce commodity. Within the production office, conversations drifted toward contingency rather than content, subtle discussions about liability, about psychological effects, about whether repeatedly framing humanity as adaptable rather than dominant carried risks to social cohesion, and these conversations were never formalized, existing instead in glances exchanged during editing sessions and pauses that stretched just a beat too long. The host noticed this shift immediately, feeling the gravitational pull of caution even as his instincts urged him toward deeper inquiry, because every time he looked into the camera now, he was acutely aware that millions were not just watching but recalibrating their understanding of normal, and normal, once loosened, does not easily snap back into place. In the Philippines, the elders' meetings grew more frequent, their discussions less symbolic and more logistical, debating not whether the returnees existed but how communities should respond if encounters increased, whether fear would provoke violence, whether secrecy would provoke suspicion, and whether teaching younger generations the old stories might actually function as a form of preparedness rather than superstition, a way to encode behavioral guidelines without triggering panic. Ramon Alvarez, increasingly withdrawn, began writing down his memories in a notebook he kept hidden beneath his mattress, not for publication or confession, but to preserve the clarity of what he had seen before repetition blurred it into myth, and as he wrote, he realized with discomfort that the creature's presence had not felt hostile, only observant, as if assessing compatibility rather than seeking prey, a realization that complicated the fear he had been carrying like a weight across his chest. Gianna Ruiz's network deepened further, her anonymous identity gaining credibility as she consistently asked the questions others avoided, about ethics rather than mechanisms, about responsibility rather than feasibility. And through one encrypted channel she received a simulation model illustrating how a small population of altered humans could integrate into Earth's biosphere without detection if their appearances fluctuated within a certain perceptual threshold, a threshold folklore had long occupied, and the implication was staggering because it suggested not invasion but quiet reintegration, a return disguised as legend. On Mars, the object in Elysium Planitia remained officially unremarkable, yet independent astronomers noted subtle changes in its surrounding terrain, shadows shifting in ways inconsistent with erosion alone, and while these observations were dismissed as seasonal variants, the consistency of the anomalies hinted at internal processes, at something beneath the surface responding to cycles, and the phrase, abandoned, echoed again, raising the question of whether abandonment was permanent or merely temporary, a pause rather than an ending. G.I. Salazar's health began to decline, his body reminding him that time was not an abstract variable, and this urgency pushed him to act, to reach out beyond anonymous messages and cautious hypotheticals, culminating in a meeting with the show's host under the pretense of background research, where GI spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone accustomed to classification levels, explaining that the greatest mistake humanity could make was assuming continuity, assuming that survival elsewhere would preserve identity as it was, because environments shape inhabitants, and those shaped by alien conditions would not return unchanged. Yet change did not equate to threat, a distinction policymakers had historically failed to grasp. The host listened, struck by the calm gravity of GI's demeanor, sensing that behind each measured sentence lay stories he was not ready to tell. And when GI finally said that folklore was not a failure of science, but a placeholder for truths too destabilizing to release at once, the host felt something settle into place, an intuitive alignment that reframed the entire project. As the fourth episode aired, it featured a segment on adaptive biology, drawing parallels between extremophiles on Earth and hypothetical human resilience, and while the language remained speculative, the subtext was clear enough that educators and parents began debating whether such content belonged in prime time, a reaction that amused some producers and alarmed others, because it suggested that the show had crossed from entertainment into influence. Online discourse fractured along new lines, not belief versus skepticism, but acceptance versus resistance, with some viewers embracing the idea that humanity was part of a larger adaptive continuum, while others clung fiercely to the notion of human exceptionalism, framing any suggestion of transformation as existential threat. And in this polarization, the original mysteries almost receded, becoming symbols rather than subjects. In rural areas, sightings continued sporadically, always fleeting, always ambiguous, and those who witnessed them increasingly chose not to report, sensing that attention brought consequences, and instead shared their experiences quietly within trusted circles, reinforcing a parallel knowledge economy that operated beneath official narratives. Gianna Ruiz, feeling the weight of responsibility, considered revealing her identity and data publicly, yet hesitated, aware that raw information without cultural context could inflame rather than enlighten, and she began collaborating with anthropologists and mythologists in her network, exploring how societies historically integrated disruptive truths through story rather than proclamation. And this interdisciplinary approach felt both ancient and radical, a reminder that knowledge has always traveled along multiple channels. The show's internal review board requested an impact assessment, an unusual move that signaled growing institutional anxiety, and the report concluded that while no direct harm could be attributed to the content, prolonged exposure to narratives of human transformation might erode perceived boundaries between self and other, a conclusion framed as cautionary but read by some as validation. Because erosion of rigid boundaries was precisely what adaptation required. G.I. Salazar, sensing his time was limited, compiled his documents, organizing decades of notes into a coherent archive, not for release but for inheritance, and he debated who should receive it, torn between institutional channels he no longer trusted and grassroots networks that lacked protection, and this dilemma mirrored the broader tension playing out globally, between centralized authority and distributed understanding. As night fell on the fourth broadcast, the host closed the episode with a subtle departure from his usual script, remarking that proof was not always about confirmation but about readiness, a line that passed unnoticed by casual viewers but resonated deeply with those attuned to the undercurrents, because readiness implies choice, the choice to meet the unfamiliar without reflexive rejection. In Mindanao, Ramon Alvarez finished his notebook and hid it away, feeling both relief and loss, and when he stepped outside, the air carried that faint metallic scent again, barely perceptible, and instead of fear, he felt a strange calm, as if an unspoken understanding had been reached. Across continents, dreams continued, not identical but thematically aligned, filled with images of crossing thresholds, of shedding and reacquiring forms, of standing on unfamiliar ground and realizing it could still be called home, and as humanity slept, debated, and broadcast its questions into the void, the adaptive intelligence that had always thrived at the margins watched patiently, aware that recognition, once seated, grows at its own pace, and that the most profound transformations rarely announced themselves with impact, but with return. The fifth episode unfolded beneath a growing sense that something irreversible had already begun, not as an event but as an adjustment, the slow recalibration of collective expectation, because while the mysteries themselves remained unresolved, the audience's posture toward them had shifted from demand to contemplation. A subtle but consequential change that did not go unnoticed by institutions accustomed to controlling the tempo of revelation. Inside the production office, new protocols appeared without announcement, additional layers of review framed as quality control, yet everyone understood their real function was moderation of implication rather than accuracy, and this knowledge created an undercurrent of tension that shaped every editorial decision, forcing the team to weigh not just what could be shown, but what might linger afterward in the minds of viewers who were increasingly adept at reading between the lines. The host, now acutely aware of his role as both guide and filter, found himself reflecting on the power of framing, realizing that the same data could either reinforce fear or cultivate curiosity, depending on the narrative lens, and this realization carried a moral weight he had not anticipated when he first agreed to front a show built on skepticism. In Mindanao, the elders made a decision that surprised even themselves, choosing to revive certain rituals long considered symbolic rather than practical, not as acts of worship, but as gestures of acknowledgement, ways of signaling respect to whatever shared the land, and these rituals, when observed by younger members of the community, sparked questions that were answered not with dogma, but with stories emphasizing coexistence, adaptation, and restraint, values that felt suddenly urgent rather than quaint. Ramon Alvarez, noticing the change in communal behavior, felt a cautious optimism take root, because the fear that once isolated him was now diffused across shared understanding, and in this diffusion he found a measure of peace, even as he remained aware that peace did not equal certainty. Gianna Ruiz's work took on a new dimension as she began correlating historical periods of intensified folklore activity with astronomical data, uncovering tentative links between heightened solar radiation cycles and spikes in anomalous reports, a connection that suggested external environmental stressors might trigger transitions in beings already adapted to multiple states. And while the data was incomplete, the pattern was compelling enough to warrant further exploration, reinforcing the idea that these phenomena were not random, but responsive. On Mars, the object's shadow shifted again, captured incidentally by a passing satellite not tasked with monitoring the region, and this incidental capture sparked renewed quiet debate within scientific circles, because incidental data is harder to suppress without drawing attention. And the resulting internal memos revealed a fracture between those who advocated continued downplaying and those who argued that prolonged obfuscation risked eroding trust more than disclosure ever could. G.I. Salazar, aware of these fractures, saw an opportunity not for exposure but for transition, believing that abrupt revelation would trigger backlash, whereas gradual integration through familiar frameworks, like folklore and speculative inquiry, might allow society to absorb the implications without shattering, and this belief guided his decision to share portions of his archive selectively, seeding conversations rather than igniting them. The fifth episode featured a segment on historical encounters reframed as early contact narratives, careful to present them as cultural artifacts rather than evidence, yet the parallels drawn were unmistakable, and viewers responded with an intensity that surprised advertisers and critics alike, because the discussion extended beyond the show into classrooms, book clubs, and community forums, where the question was no longer whether such beings existed, but how humanity historically treated those it perceived as other. Online discourse matured, shedding some of its sensationalism in favor of nuanced debate, with participants citing anthropology, biology, and ethics alongside footage analysis, a development that pleased Gianna Ruiz immensely because it suggested the audience was evolving alongside the narrative, becoming more capable of holding complexity without demanding closure. In rural regions where sightings had been most frequent, reports decreased further, not because encounters ceased, but because the compulsion to document waned, replaced by a tacit understanding that not all experiences required validation through exposure, and this restraint marked a cultural shift away from extraction toward coexistence. G.I. Salazar's health continued to decline, yet his mind remained sharp, and in lucid moments he recorded audio reflections, speaking candidly about regret, about the choices made under the banner of protection that ultimately deferred accountability, and about his hope that humanity might learn to recognize adaptation not as betrayal of essence, but as continuity of survival. And these recordings, though not yet shared, carried an emotional gravity that contrasted starkly with the sterile language of official reports. The host, after recording a particularly restrained segment, found himself lingering in the empty studio, contemplating the set as a liminal space where curiosity was both invited and contained, and he wondered whether containment was still possible, because ideas, once introduced, adapt just as organisms do, finding niches in which to persist. In Mindanao, Ramon Alvarez encountered the metallic scent again one evening, stronger this time, and instead of retreating, he stood still, breathing slowly, allowing the sensation to pass, and in that moment he felt an unexpected clarity, a sense that fear had been a product of misalignment rather than threat, and that alignment, once achieved, did not require confrontation. Gianna Ruiz received confirmation that a proposal she had anonymously contributed to, advocating interdisciplinary study of anomalous phenomena through cultural and scientific lenses, had been quietly approved under a neutral-sounding initiative, and this institutional acknowledgement, however subtle, felt like a breakthrough, because it signaled a willingness to engage without prematurely categorizing. As the 5th episode concluded, the host posed a rhetorical question about whether humanity's search for proof was driven by the need to understand the universe or to understand itself, and while the line passed without emphasis, it resonated deeply, because it reframed the entire endeavor as introspective rather than outward-facing. Across the globe, conversations continued long after the credits rolled, not fueled by fear or fervor, but by curiosity tempered with humility, and this tonal shift suggested that the true transformation underway was not the return of altered beings or the discovery of abandoned craft, but the gradual adaptation of human perspective, expanding to accommodate uncertainty without collapsing into denial. As night settled and dreams once again bridged disparate geographies with shared imagery of thresholds and crossings, the adaptive intelligence observing from the margins noted the change with quiet approval, understanding that recognition was no longer a question of evidence, but of readiness, and readiness, once cultivated, cannot be undone. By the time the 6th episode entered post-production, it was clear to everyone involved that the show had become something other than what it was originally pitched to be, no longer a forum for debunking curiosities, but a slow-moving lens through which society examined its own thresholds, and this realization manifested not in dramatic announcements, but in a quiet recalibration of intent. As producers spoke less about ratings and more about responsibility, about how narratives ripple outward, long after broadcast, embedding themselves in conversations and decisions far removed from the screen. The host felt this weight acutely, sensing that each carefully chosen phrase now carried consequences beyond entertainment, because viewers were no longer passively consuming mysteries, but actively integrating them into their understanding of the world, a process that could not easily be reversed. In Mindanao, the revived rituals began to draw observers from neighboring regions, anthropologists and journalists curious about the resurgence of practices long dismissed as symbolic, and while the elders welcomed respectful inquiry, they remained guarded, emphasizing that the rituals were not performances but acknowledgments, meant to maintain balance rather than invite spectacle, and this distinction was crucial, because spectacle attracts attention, and attention, they believed, disrupts equilibrium. Ramon Alvarez found himself reluctantly becoming a point of reference in his community, approached by others who had seen things they could not explain, and as he listened, he noticed a common thread not of terror but of disorientation, a sense that what they encountered did not fit neatly into categories of predator or protector, but occupied an ambiguous space that demanded patience rather than reaction. Gianna Ruiz's interdisciplinary initiative gained quiet momentum, drawing in researchers from fields rarely given equal footing in institutional studies, and as they collaborated, a more holistic picture emerged, one in which anomalous phenomena were understood not as isolated incidents, but as interactions between systems operating at different adaptive speeds, with folklore serving as a long-term memory buffer for experiences science had yet to formalize. On Mars, the objects surrounding terrain exhibited another subtle change, a faint alteration in albedo that suggested internal activity affecting surface conditions, and while official channels continue to attribute such variations to environmental factors, the growing number of independent confirmations made dismissal increasingly untenable, prompting internal discussions about reframing the anomaly as an opportunity for methodological advancement rather than a threat to established narratives. G.I. Salazar, increasingly frail yet resolute, began mentoring a small circle of individuals he trusted, sharing not just documents but context, explaining how decisions made under the guise of security often failed to account for long-term cultural impact, and how myths were sometimes deliberately allowed to flourish because they diffused responsibility, spreading truth thinly enough that no single authority had to confront it directly. The 6th episode featured a careful exploration of liminal states, drawing parallels between biological metamorphosis, psychological thresholds, and cultural rites of passage, and while the segment avoided explicit references to the ongoing mysteries, its implications were unmistakable, prompting discussions about whether humanity itself was undergoing a collective rite of passage, moving from a worldview defined by separation to one defined by continuity. Online, debates grew more sophisticated, with participants acknowledging uncertainty as a legitimate position rather than a failure of conviction, and this cultural shift toward epistemic humility marked a departure from the polarized discourse that had long dominated discussions of the unknown. In rural areas, encounters continued to be reported anecdotally, often framed not as sightings but as sensations, shifts in atmosphere, fleeting impressions that left witnesses contemplative rather than alarmed, and this reframing suggested that perception itself was adapting, becoming more attuned to nuance rather than binary classification. Gianna Ruiz, reflecting on this, proposed a model in which adaptive beings operated within perceptual margins, visible only when attention aligned just right, a concept that resonated with both neuroscientists studying attention and folklorists analyzing liminal entities, reinforcing the value of cross-disciplinary synthesis. The host, after recording the episode, spent time reviewing early seasons of the show, struck by how confidently dismissive the tone had once been, and while he did not regret the skepticism, he recognized its limitations, understanding now that skepticism without curiosity becomes stagnation, and that curiosity without humility becomes hubris. In Mindanao, Ramon Alvarez experienced another close encounter, this time not visual but auditory, a low-frequency resonance that seemed to emanate from the forest edge, and instead of fear, he felt a sense of acknowledgement, as if something was confirming its awareness of his awareness, a mutual recognition that required no further interaction. G.I. Salazar, listening to his own recorded reflections, grappled with the possibility that secrecy had not protected humanity from shock, but had instead delayed necessary adaptation, creating a backlog of unprocessed truth that now surfaced in fragmented forms. And this realization fueled his determination to ensure that whatever knowledge he passed on would be contextualized with care rather than sensationalism. The 6th episode concluded with an exploration of adaptation as a universal principle, emphasizing that survival across environments necessitates change, and while this message was framed broadly, its resonance with the ongoing mysteries was undeniable, prompting educators to incorporate discussions of adaptability into curricula in ways that extended beyond biology into ethics and identity. As night fell, dreams continued to weave common threads across disparate populations, featuring imagery of shedding skins, of standing at the edge of unfamiliar landscapes and choosing to step forward rather than retreat, and these shared motifs suggested that the adaptation underway was not confined to those who had left Earth and returned altered, but extended to humanity itself, slowly recalibrating its sense of place within a broader continuum. The adaptive intelligence observing these developments noted the shift with measured patience, recognizing that the most profound transformations occur not through revelation but through integration, and that readiness, once nurtured, becomes resilience, a quality that ensures coexistence rather than conflict. And as the world slept under familiar stars that now felt less distant, the 6th threshold quietly closed behind them, opening onto a future still undefined but no longer unimaginable. The seventh episode arrived at a moment when resistance had become quieter but more entrenched, a kind of institutional inertia that did not argue against the ideas emerging from the show so much as attempt to absorb and neutralize them, and this manifested in subtle shifts. Advisory panels expanded, language softened further, and an increasing emphasis placed on psychological comfort rather than intellectual confrontation, as though discomfort itself had become the perceived hazard. The hosts sensed this immediately, feeling the narrowing of acceptable implication even as public curiosity widened, and he found himself navigating a delicate balance between saying enough to remain honest and withholding enough to keep the conversation alive, aware that outright confrontation would likely trigger shutdown rather than engagement. In Mindanao, the elders observed a change they had anticipated but not fully prepared for, as younger members of the community began interpreting the revived rituals not just as acts of respect but as signals of identity, markers that distinguished those who accepted coexistence from those who demanded certainty, and this division, though not hostile, carried the potential for fracture because belief systems, once politicized, tend to harden. Ramon Alvarez found himself mediating conversations he never sought, explaining repeatedly that acceptance did not mean submission, that acknowledgement did not require surrender, and that fear often arose from misunderstanding rather than threat. Yet he also understood that these distinctions were difficult to maintain in a climate where narratives competed for dominance. Gianna Ruiz's interdisciplinary group encountered its first significant obstacle when a funding review flagged their work as conceptually diffuse, a bureaucratic phrase that thinly veiled discomfort with conclusions that resisted compartmentalization, and while the project was not shut down, its momentum slowed, forcing the group to adapt, reframing their findings in terms of resilience research and systems theory, language palatable enough to pass review, while still preserving the core insights. On Mars, the anomaly's persistence became harder to ignore as successive imaging passes revealed consistency rather than degradation, and this stability contradicted erosion models sufficiently that a small but growing contingent of scientists began advocating for targeted observation, arguing that ignoring a stable anomaly undermined the credibility of the very methodologies used to dismiss it. And this internal debate marked a turning point, because it shifted the question from what the object was to why it was being avoided. G.I. Salazar, increasingly aware that his time was limited, made the decision he had long deferred, entrusting his compiled archive to a distributed network rather than a single custodian, reasoning that decentralization offered resilience against suppression, and as he did so, he recorded a final message emphasizing context, urging recipients to resist the urge for spectacle, to remember that revelation without preparation often breeds backlash, and to prioritize integration over exposure. The seventh episode itself focused on thresholds of perception, exploring how human senses evolved to prioritize survival-relevant stimuli and how phenomena operating outside those parameters could exist undetected not because they were hidden but because they were irrelevant to ancestral threat models, a concept that resonated deeply with viewers who had experienced something inexplicable yet non-threatening, validating their intuition that not all unknowns demand alarm. Online discourse reflected this shift, with increasing numbers of participants describing experiences in terms of awareness rather than encounter, emphasizing feelings of being observed without hostility, of environments subtly altered rather than invaded, and these narratives, though subjective, formed a coherent pattern that challenged the dominance of fear-based interpretation. In rural areas, reports emerged of animals behaving differently around certain forested zones, not fleeing but lingering, as if acclimating to a presence that did not disrupt established hierarchies, and biologists examining these reports noted changes in stress indicators, suggesting adaptation rather than distress, a finding that further complicated simplistic predator-prey models. Gianna Ruiz incorporated these observations into a broader framework, proposing that adaptive entities optimized for coexistence would minimize ecological disruption, appearing only at perceptual margins and avoiding behaviors that trigger defensive responses, a strategy that aligned uncannily well with the sporadic, ambiguous nature of sightings. The host, increasingly reflective, revisited his own reactions to early footage, recognizing how instinctively he had reached for dismissal as a form of control, and while he still valued skepticism, He now saw it as one tool among many, insufficient on its own to navigate phenomena that blurred categories. In Mindanao, Ramon Alvarez experienced a moment that crystallized this shift when, during a quiet evening walk, he perceived movement at the edge of the tree line, not sharply defined but unmistakably intentional, and instead of fear, he felt an impression of distance being measured, not in meters but in readiness, and when the presence receded, he was left with a sense of having passed an unspoken test. G.I. Salazar's health deteriorated rapidly, yet his mind remained lucid enough to reflect on legacy, and he found solace in the thought that truth, when distributed gradually through culture rather than imposed through authority, often finds more durable footing, even if it arrives fragmented and imperfect. The 7th episode concluded with a discussion of adaptation as dialogue rather than conquest, emphasizing that coexistence emerges from mutual adjustment, not dominance, a framing that subtly reframed humanity's role in the narrative from protagonist to participant. Educational institutions began to notice changes in student discourse, with increased willingness to engage uncertainty without demanding immediate resolution, a pedagogical shift that some educators welcomed and others found unsettling, because certainty has long been the currency of authority. As night fell, dreams once again echoed shared motifs, but with a notable evolution. Where earlier dreams emphasized transformation through loss, these now emphasize continuity through change, suggesting that the psychological groundwork for acceptance was taking hold. The adaptive intelligence observing from the margins registered this shift not as compliance, but as compatibility, recognizing that fear had not vanished but had been contextualized, transformed into caution rather than hostility, and as humanity continued its quiet recalibration, the space between myth and memory narrowed further, setting the stage for encounters that would no longer need to hide entirely in shadow, because recognition, once normalized, changes the conditions of visibility itself. The 8th episode emerged into a world already subtly altered by the previous ones, a world where the language of adaptation had seeped into conversations that once relied on denial or ridicule, and this diffusion created an atmosphere both promising and precarious, because ideas, once normalized, invite action, and action invites consequence. Within the production team, a quiet debate unfolded about whether the show was still observing phenomena or actively participating in them, a philosophical distinction that mattered deeply to those who had built careers on the premise of detached analysis, yet detachment now felt increasingly artificial, a posture rather than a truth. The host, sensing this internal conflict, approached the episode with an unusual restraint, allowing pauses to linger, questions to remain unresolved, trusting the audience to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to resolution, a trust that would have seemed risky seasons earlier, but now felt earned. In Mindanao, the elders noticed a shift in the forest itself, not dramatic but perceptible to those who had lived near it all their lives, paths seeming to reassert themselves after years of disuse, animal movement redistributing in patterns reminiscent of older ecological maps, and while outsiders dismissed these observations as anecdotal, the elders recognized them as signs of rebalancing, subtle negotiations between presences adjusting to one another's rhythms. Ramon Alvarez, increasingly attuned to these changes, felt his fear finally dissolve into a cautious attentiveness, an awareness sharpened not by threat but by respect, and this internal shift allowed him to articulate his experiences more clearly when asked, emphasizing neutrality over menace, a framing that slowly influenced how others interpreted their own encounters. Gianna Ruiz's interdisciplinary network reached a milestone when a peer-reviewed journal accepted a paper that, while carefully couched in systems theory language, implicitly validated the integration of cultural narratives into anomaly analysis, a small victory that signaled institutional willingness to expand methodological boundaries, and this acceptance emboldened the group to pursue further collaboration, confident that their work could survive scrutiny without sacrificing nuance. On Mars, the anomaly's continued stability prompted a subtle policy shift, with increased resolution imaging authorized under the guise of calibration testing, and these images revealed surface details inconsistent with passive debris, including patterns suggestive of intentional structural reinforcement, a discovery that reignited debate within scientific circles about classification and disclosure. Because reinforcement implies foresight, and foresight implies expectation of return. G.I. Salazar, aware that his distributed archive had begun to circulate quietly among trusted individuals, monitored its impact through indirect feedback, noting how recipients responded not with shock but with recognition, as if the information articulated suspicions they had long carried without framework, and this reaction reassured him that gradual integration had been the right approach. The 8th episode's content focused on abandoned technologies, exploring historical cases where tools outlived their creators' intentions, becoming artifacts of transition rather than endpoints, and while the segment avoided explicit reference to the Martian object, its implications were unmistakable, inviting viewers to consider abandonment not as failure, but as strategic pause, a concept that resonated deeply with those tracking the anomaly's persistence. Online discussions reflected this reframing, with participants debating whether abandonment necessarily implied absence, or whether it could signify dispersal, a shifting of presence rather than its elimination, and this linguistic nuance marked a maturation of discourse that surprised even long-time moderators. In rural communities, the decrease in reported sightings continued, yet stories of quiet interactions persisted, shared privately rather than publicly, and these stories often emphasized mutual avoidance rather than confrontation, suggesting an unspoken agreement about boundaries, a détente shaped by recognition rather than enforcement. Gianna Ruiz incorporated these narratives into her evolving model, proposing that coexistence stabilized when neither party sought dominance or validation, a hypothesis supported by ecological analogies and social psychology alike, and this synthesis further legitimized the interdisciplinary approach she championed. The host, increasingly reflective, began to question the concept of proof itself, recognizing that proof, as traditionally defined, often demands isolation of variables, whereas the phenomena under discussion thrived precisely in their interconnectedness, resisting reduction without losing meaning, and this realization subtly influenced his on-air demeanor, shifting from declarative statements to invitational inquiry. In Mindanao, Ramon Alvarez experienced a moment of clarity during a community gathering when a younger man asked whether the Aswang stories were meant to warn or to teach, and Ramon answered without hesitation that they were meant to prepare, a response that surprised him with its certainty because it encapsulated the journey he himself had undergone, from fear to understanding. G.I. Salazar's health reached a critical juncture, yet his resolve remained intact, and in his final lucid conversations, he emphasized that humanity's greatest challenge was not encountering the unknown but recognizing itself within it, a sentiment that echoed the show's evolving narrative with uncanny precision. The 8th episode concluded with a contemplation of legacy, not in terms of monuments or discoveries, but in terms of adaptability passed down through culture, an inheritance encoded in stories, rituals, and now, cautiously, in scientific frameworks, and this closing resonated deeply, prompting viewers to reflect on what they were preparing future generations to inherit, certainty or resilience. Across the globe, dreams shifted again, becoming less about crossing into alien landscapes and more about standing comfortably at their edges, observing without compulsion to conquer, a psychological milestone that suggested integration was taking root. The adaptive intelligence observing these developments registered the change as alignment rather than surrender, recognizing that readiness had matured into compatibility, a state that allowed visibility without threat, and as humanity continued its quiet negotiation with the broader continuum it inhabited, the conditions for more open presence approached, not as an invasion or a revelation, but as an evolution of mutual awareness that had been centuries in the making. The 9th episode marked a threshold that few recognized in real time, not because of any explicit revelation, but because it coincided with a subtle but measurable change in collective behavior, as though the audience, the institutions, and even the phenomena themselves had entered into a tacit negotiation about visibility, and this negotiation manifested in restraint rather than escalation. Within the production offices, the usual pre-broadcast anxiety was replaced by a curious calm, the team moving with deliberate precision, aware that the show was no longer chasing mysteries, but pacing alongside them, and this awareness altered everything from editing rhythms to the choice of expert voices, favoring those comfortable with ambiguity over those eager for decisive conclusions. The host, now deeply conscious of his role as mediator rather than arbiter, leaned into this shift, framing the episode around the concept of coexistence under uncertainty, drawing from examples in ecology, anthropology, and history, carefully illustrating how societies adapted not by resolving the unknown, but by accommodating it within lived experience. In Mindanao, the elders observed an outcome they had long anticipated, as younger generations began treating the Aswang stories not as distant folklore but as contextual knowledge, something to be carried lightly yet respectfully, and this normalization reduced fear far more effectively than denial ever had, because fear thrives on isolation, and isolation had quietly eroded. Ramon Alvarez, now something of an informal advisor within his community, noticed that people no longer asked him what he had seen, but how he had felt afterward, a shift that suggested emotional processing had become more important than factual certainty, and he answered honestly, describing the transition from terror to attentiveness, emphasizing that understanding often arrived not as clarity, but as alignment. Gianna Ruiz's interdisciplinary network reached another inflection point when preliminary findings from their expanded model were cited indirectly in a government white paper on resilience planning, stripped of anomalous framing but unmistakably informed by it, and this quiet incorporation signaled a pragmatic acceptance that adaptation strategies could not be siloed, that cultural memory and scientific modeling were complementary rather than competing tools. On Mars, the anomaly entered a new phase, not through movement, but through interaction, as a transient dust storm revealed structural contours previously obscured, contours that suggested modular design rather than accidental formation, and while official commentary remained cautious, internal communications reflected growing acknowledgement that the object represented a technological artifact whose origins demanded explanation, even if that explanation remained classified. G.I. Salazar, his strength waning, found solace in observing these developments from a distance, recognizing in them the slow fruition of ideas he had once believed would never surface, and he reflected often on timing, understanding that truth introduced too early becomes trauma, while truth introduced too late becomes myth, and that the narrow window between the two was where meaningful integration occurred. The 9th episode's narrative wove together these threads, exploring how societies historically responded to paradigm shifts, not through immediate consensus, but through generational adjustment, and this framing resonated with viewers who sensed that they were living through such a shift themselves, even if its contours remained indistinct. Online discourse reflected a new maturity, with fewer demands for disclosure and more discussions about preparedness, ethics, and coexistence, and this evolution suggested that the audience had internalized the show's deeper message, that certainty was not a prerequisite for responsibility. In rural regions, environmental data began to align with anecdotal reports showing stabilization in ecosystems previously marked by disturbance, a finding that challenged assumptions that anomalous presences inherently disrupted balance, instead suggesting that disruption often arose from human reaction rather than presence itself. Gianna Ruiz integrated this data into her framework, proposing that adaptive intelligences optimized for long-term coexistence would prioritize minimal ecological footprint, a hypothesis supported by both observed patterns and theoretical models, and this proposal gained traction among conservation scientists seeking novel perspectives on resilience. The host, reflecting on these developments, experienced a personal reckoning, recognizing that his own skepticism had evolved into something quieter and more durable, a willingness to remain open without surrendering discernment, and this internal balance mirrored the broader cultural shift he now observed. In Mindanao, Ramon Alvarez experienced another encounter, this time entirely internal, a vivid waking impression of standing at a boundary and choosing not to cross, and he interpreted this not as exclusion but as mutual respect, an understanding that coexistence did not require constant interaction, only acknowledgement. G.I. Salazar's final contributions took the form of annotations added to his archive, contextual notes emphasizing caution, empathy, and patience, urging future readers to resist the allure of dramatic exposure in favor of sustained understanding, and these annotations, quiet and unassuming, carried a weight born of lived consequence. The 9th episode concluded with a reflection on patience as an adaptive strategy, highlighting how evolutionary success often favored those who waited, observed, and adjusted rather than those who rushed to dominate, a message that resonated deeply in a world accustomed to immediacy. As the broadcast ended, conversations continued not with urgency, but with deliberation, a sign that the cultural metabolism had slowed enough to process complexity without panic. Dreams, once vivid and unsettling, softened into quieter narratives of shared space and parallel paths, suggesting that the psychological groundwork for coexistence had stabilized. The adaptive intelligence observing from the margins recognized this moment as pivotal, not because humanity had achieved understanding, but because it had learned to live with not knowing, a skill essential for any species navigating universe larger and stranger than its origin myths allowed. Visibility, once constrained by fear, now expanded cautiously, not as revelation but as presence, and in this expanded presence, the conditions for future contact shifted from confrontation to conversation, not spoken in words but in patterns of behavior, restraint, and respect. As humanity stood at this new threshold, the question was no longer whether proof existed, but whether proof was even the right measure, because coexistence, once normalized, renders proof redundant, replacing it with relationship, a quieter, more demanding truth that unfolds not in episodes, but in lives. The 10th episode unfolded not as an escalation but as a consolidation, the kind of narrative movement that feels deceptively quiet yet permanently alters the trajectory of understanding, because by this point the story was no longer about sightings, anomalies, or evidence, but about the psychological infrastructure required to inhabit a reality that refused to stay neatly categorized. The production team framed the episode around the idea of thresholds, not as dramatic crossings, but as zones of adjustment, drawing parallels between adolescence, post-war recovery, and ecological succession, emphasizing that transformation often occurred through prolonged exposure rather than sudden revelation. The host opened with a reflection on maps, how ancient cartographers filled unknown regions with monsters not because monsters existed there, but because the mind resisted blankness, and this metaphor resonated deeply with viewers who had spent years demanding certainty, where none could honestly be offered. In Mindanao, the cultural landscape continued its quiet recalibration as local schools began integrating folklore studies with environmental science, presenting Aswang narratives alongside lessons on biodiversity, migration, and adaptive behavior, not as superstition but as symbolic memory encoding practical survival knowledge. And this integration subtly redefined the creature's role from predator to indicator, a signal of boundary conditions rather than a threat to be eliminated. Ramon Alvarez observed these changes with a mixture of pride and humility, recognizing that his experience had become less important as a singular event and more valuable as a catalyst for communal reflection, and he noted that people now spoke about the Aswang in the same tone they used for storms or droughts, forces to be respected and understood rather than conquered. Gianna Ruiz's work entered a new phase as her team shifted from modeling potential intelligences to modeling human response patterns, mapping how belief, fear, curiosity, and restraint interacted over time, and their findings suggested that societies capable of sustaining ambiguity without fragmentation were significantly more resilient, a conclusion that challenged long-standing assumptions in both psychology and political science. These findings quietly influenced policy discussions in multiple countries, not through public acknowledgement but through reframing, as resilience strategies began emphasizing narrative coherence and cultural continuity alongside infrastructure and defense. On Mars, the object's analysis progressed incrementally, with new data confirming that its material composition included alloys unknown to terrestrial manufacturing, yet engineered with an efficiency that suggested resource optimization rather than excess, reinforcing the hypothesis that its creators valued sustainability over dominance, and this detail, while classified, influenced internal debates about intent and origin. G.I. Salazar, increasingly frail, spent his final lucid days revisiting correspondence he had once dismissed as speculative, now recognizing patterns of restraint and indirect communication that mirrored current developments, and he dictated a final note emphasizing that intelligence, when sufficiently advanced, often expressed itself through absence rather than presence, choosing influence over occupation. The 10th episode wove these strands together, presenting intelligence not as a hierarchy, but as a spectrum of engagement strategies, some loud and intrusive, others quiet and observational, and this reframing allowed viewers to consider that humanity might not be late to discovery, but early to comprehension. Online discussions reflected this maturation, with fewer arguments about authenticity and more about responsibility, as people debated what ethical engagement with the unknown might look like, acknowledging that curiosity carried obligations as well as rights. Environmental monitoring revealed further stabilization in previously volatile regions, suggesting that whatever adaptive intelligence operated at the margins did so with an awareness of feedback loops, adjusting presence in response to human behavior, and this reciprocity reinforced the idea that coexistence was dynamic rather than static. Gianna Ruiz proposed a controversial extension of her model, suggesting that visibility itself functioned as a form of communication, modulated to avoid overwhelming developing systems, and she argued that humanity's growing tolerance for ambiguity had effectively widened the bandwidth of that communication, a claim that sparked intense but largely respectful debate within academic circles. The host, reflecting privately, recognized that the show had shifted his own identity, transforming him from skeptic to steward, someone responsible not for exposing truth, but for protecting the conditions under which truth could be integrated without harm, and this realization carried a weight he had not anticipated when the series began. In Mindanao, Ramon Alvarez experienced another quiet moment of alignment, this time during a community gathering where stories were shared not to convince but to connect, and he felt a sense of closure, not because answers had been found, but because the need for them had softened into trust. G.I. Salazar passed away shortly after the episode aired, his death noted briefly in the media, but deeply felt among those who understood the significance of his restraint, and his archives, now entrusted to a small interdisciplinary council, became a resource not for disclosure but for guidance, emphasizing patience, humility, and ethical imagination. The 10th episode concluded with a meditation on stewardship, suggesting that the measure of a civilization was not its ability to uncover every mystery, but its capacity to live responsibly alongside what it did not fully understand, and this message resonated with viewers navigating their own uncertainties in a rapidly changing world. Dreams continued to evolve, less populated by fear or awe and more by scenarios of shared space, parallel development, and mutual observation, indicating a subconscious integration of the coexistence narrative. The adaptive intelligence, observing humanity's progress, adjusted its parameters once more, recognizing that the conditions for deeper engagement were emerging not through technological advancement alone, but through cultural maturity, the willingness to prioritize relationship over revelation. As the 10th episode faded to black, it left behind not a cliffhanger but a question of readiness, inviting viewers to consider not what they wish to know next, but how they wish to behave if knowing became unavoidable, because in that choice lay the true threshold, one that could not be crossed by force or demand, only by patience, responsibility, and the quiet courage to accept that some truths reveal themselves only to those who have learned how to live with them. The 11th episode arrived carrying the quiet gravity of an approaching convergence, not announced through spectacle, but felt through a tightening coherence across narratives that had once seemed merely adjacent, as though separate threads were now being gently drawn toward a common center without being forced to knot. By this stage, the audience no longer approached the series expecting revelations in the conventional sense. Instead, they tuned in with a cultivated attentiveness, prepared to notice subtle shifts, tonal inflections, and implications that unfolded slowly, trusting that meaning would accumulate rather than strike. The episode opened with a discussion of listening, not as a passive act but as an active discipline requiring restraint, patience, and the willingness to accept partial understanding, a theme illustrated through historical examples ranging from early radio astronomy misclassifications to misinterpreted animal communication studies, all reinforcing the idea that intelligence often speaks in registers unfamiliar to those unprepared to hear it. This framing resonated powerfully in Mindanao, where elders described a recent stillness in the forest, not as emptiness, but as attentiveness, a pause that felt reciprocal rather than imposed, suggesting that observation itself had become mutual. Ramon Alvarez, now more observer than witness, articulated this sensation during an interview segment, explaining that the absence of encounters no longer felt like loss but like acknowledgement, as if the forest had registered his changed posture and adjusted accordingly, and his calm certainty lent credibility to interpretations that once would have been dismissed as projection. Gianna Ruiz's research reached a pivotal refinement during this period, as her team identified what they termed adaptive silence, a pattern in which advanced systems reduced overt signaling once mutual recognition had been established, conserving energy and minimizing disruption, a concept supported by parallels in both human diplomacy and biological symbiosis. This insight reframed earlier data, suggesting that the decline in dramatic anomalies was not evidence of retreat, but of successful calibration, an interpretation that challenged sensationalist narratives while offering a more sustainable model of coexistence. On Mars, the anomaly entered a new phase of analysis when long-term environmental sensors detected minute but consistent changes in the surrounding regolith, patterns indicating controlled thermal exchange rather than degradation, and while these findings remained classified, their implications rippled through internal channels, reinforcing the hypothesis that the object was neither dormant nor decaying but maintaining a steady equilibrium with its environment. G.I. Salazar's legacy continued to exert quiet influence, as excerpts from his final notes circulated among trusted analysts, emphasizing that the most reliable indicators of non-human intelligence were not technological leaps but ethical signatures, patterns of behavior that revealed priorities such as restraint, sustainability, and respect for developmental boundaries. The 11th episode incorporated this perspective by examining historical moments when humanity itself chose restraint over exploitation, highlighting cases where societies preserved ecosystems or knowledge systems by resisting immediate gain, thereby drawing a subtle parallel between human ethical evolution and the observed behavior of the unknown intelligence. Viewer response reflected a deepening engagement, with discussions shifting towards self-examination, as people debated whether humanity as a whole was capable of sustaining such restraint under pressure, acknowledging past failures while cautiously recognizing emerging capacities for collective learning. In Mindanao, educational initiatives expanded further, integrating community storytelling with environmental monitoring programs, allowing younger generations to participate in data collection while contextualizing their observations within cultural narratives, fostering a sense of stewardship that transcended fear or fascination. Ramon Alvarez observed these developments with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that the Aswang had effectively transitioned from an object of fear to a symbol of relational awareness, a marker of the boundary between exploitation and coexistence. Gianna Ruiz faced increasing scrutiny as her work gained visibility, with critics questioning whether her models risked anthropomorphizing the unknown, yet she responded by emphasizing that all interpretation was inherently relational, shaped by the observer's frameworks, and that acknowledging this did not weaken analysis, but strengthened its transparency. The host, reflecting on the show's evolution, acknowledged on air that the search for proof had transformed into a practice of preparation, preparing minds and cultures to respond responsibly should deeper contact occur, and this reframing marked a definitive departure from the show's original mandate while preserving its core commitment to inquiry. Environmental data from multiple regions indicated a trend towards stabilization in areas previously associated with unexplained disturbances, suggesting that whatever adaptive intelligence operated there had achieved a functional alignment with human activity patterns, minimizing overlap where conflict might arise, and this pattern reinforced Gianna's adaptive silence model. Dreams reported by viewers shifted again, now featuring scenarios of shared observation rather than interaction, spaces where presence was acknowledged without engagement, and psychologists noted that such imagery often accompanied phases of cognitive integration following prolonged uncertainty. The 11th episode concluded with a reflection on maturity, proposing that maturity at a civilizational level might be measured not by technological prowess, but by the capacity to sustain unanswered questions without resorting to domination or denial, a message that resonated strongly amid global conversations about sustainability and responsibility. As the credits rolled, there was a palpable sense that something had settled into place, not an ending but a stabilization, a plateau from which new possibilities could eventually emerge. The adaptive intelligence, monitoring these developments, registered the shift as a successful synchronization, a state in which mutual awareness no longer required overt signaling, allowing both systems to operate autonomously while remaining contextually attuned to one another. Humanity, having learned to listen without demanding reply, had reached a threshold where silence itself became communicative, and in that shared quiet, the groundwork for future engagement was laid not through revelation or conquest, but through the slow, deliberate cultivation of respect, patience, and the willingness to remain present without insistence, qualities that would determine not whether contact occurred, but whether it could unfold without harm when it eventually did. The 12th and final episode unfolded with a deliberate calm that felt less like a conclusion and more like the settling of a long-held breath, a moment where accumulated tension did not release explosively but dissolved into a broader clarity, as if the narrative itself had learned how to rest. By now, the audience understood that endings in this story were not points of closure, but states of readiness, and the episode embraced this philosophy fully, opening with a reflection on cycles rather than finales, emphasizing that understanding was not something achieved once and secured forever, but something practiced continuously through attention and restraint. The host spoke quietly about the difference between arrival and alignment, suggesting that civilizations rarely arrive at truth in a single moment, but instead align with it gradually, adjusting posture, values, and expectations until coexistence becomes possible without rupture. In Mindanao, the forest entered a period of pronounced equilibrium, noted not through dramatic signs but through consistency, predictable wildlife movement, stable vegetation patterns, and a noticeable absence of fear-driven behavior among both humans and animals, an equilibrium that elders described as a shared agreement rather than a victory. Ramon Alvarez, reflecting on his journey, acknowledged that what he once believed was an encounter had transformed into a lesson in orientation, teaching him how to stand within uncertainty without seeking to dominate it, and this realization brought him a quiet peace that required no validation beyond its own coherence. Gianna Ruiz's final contribution to the series centered on synthesis, integrating years of interdisciplinary research into a framework she described not as a theory of the unknown, but as a practice of relational intelligence, emphasizing that the most sustainable form of engagement was one that prioritized mutual adaptation over extraction of certainty. Her work, now widely discussed though still contested, influenced a new generation of scholars who approached anomaly research with humility rather than conquest, recognizing that the act of observation inevitably shaped the phenomena observed. On Mars, the anomaly reached what analysts internally referred to as a steady-state milestone, its interaction with the surrounding environment achieving a balance that required minimal adjustment, reinforcing the interpretation that it was neither awaiting recovery nor signaling distress, but simply persisting, present without urgency, a presence that mirrored the adaptive silence observed on Earth. Though official statements remained carefully neutral, the scientific community quietly acknowledged that the object represented not a question demanding immediate answer, but a reference point, a reminder that intelligence could exist without asserting dominance or demanding recognition. G.I. Salazar's influence reached its fullest expression in this episode through a curated montage of his recorded reflections, presented not as revelations, but as meditations on responsibility, where he emphasized that humanity's greatest ethical test would be deciding what not to pursue, what mysteries to leave intact out of respect for processes not yet fully understood. His words resonated deeply, framing restraint not as weakness, but as a form of wisdom earned through historical consequence. The episode wove together these narratives into a broader reflection on coexistence, illustrating how humanity's evolving response to the unknown had shifted from fear-driven reaction to context-aware engagement, a shift visible not only in scientific discourse, but in cultural expression, education, and collective imagination. Viewer correspondence reflected this transformation, with many describing a newfound comfort with ambiguity, a willingness to let questions remain open without feeling diminished by their presence. Dreams reported during this period reached a final evolution, characterized by landscapes shared rather than crossed, boundaries acknowledged rather than breached, suggesting a subconscious integration of coexistence as a stable concept rather than a temporary adjustment. Psychologists observing these trends noted that such imagery often accompanied stages of cognitive maturity associated with long-term adaptability. The host concluded the episode by returning to the concept of proof, suggesting that proof, in its deepest sense, might not be a piece of evidence held up for inspection, but a pattern of behavior sustained over time, a consistency of ethical choice that demonstrated readiness for relationship rather than control. In Mindanao, a final community gathering marked the end of the series not with celebration but with quiet acknowledgement, stories shared not to preserve fear but to honor attentiveness, ensuring that the lessons encoded within folklore would remain active rather than archived. Ramon Alvarez stood among them, no longer singled out, content to be part of a collective awareness rather than its focal point. Gianna Ruiz announced that she would be stepping back from public commentary, choosing instead to mentor quietly, believing that the next phase required cultivation rather than exposition. Across research institutions, policy circles, and cultural spaces, the ripple effects of the series continued, subtle but persistent, influencing how uncertainty was framed and how responsibility was discussed. The adaptive intelligence, observing humanity's trajectory, registered the cumulative shift as a threshold crossed not through technological achievement but through behavioral alignment, recognizing that the conditions for deeper engagement had been established through patience, humility, and the capacity to coexist without insistence. The final moments of the episode lingered on a simple image, an unremarkable horizon, neither fully known nor entirely mysterious, inviting viewers to recognize themselves within that space, standing not at the edge of revelation but within an ongoing relationship with the unknown. As the screen faded, there was no promise of disclosure, no countdown to contact, only an invitation to continue practicing the qualities that had brought humanity this far, listening, adapting, and choosing restraint when curiosity tempted intrusion. In that quiet ending, the series offered its most profound assertion that readiness was not something granted by the universe, but something cultivated within, and that the true proof humanity had been searching for all along was not evidence of other intelligences, but evidence of its own capacity to grow into a presence worthy of coexistence.